The deed was still warm from the land office when Samuel Bancroft rode into the valley and found a woman already knee-deep in the creek, hauling out a tangle of rusted sluice equipment with her bare hands. He pulled his horse to a stop at the ridge line and stared down into the hollow where the Slater claim sat like a wound in the earth-collapsed mine shaft on the eastern edge, a half-burned cabin just barely standing on the western side, and the creek running muddy through what had once been, according to the deed papers folded in his breast pocket, one of the most promising placer gold operations in the Colorado Territory. That had been 1878. It was now the spring of 1882, and the place looked like the earth itself had given up on it, except for the woman. She was wearing a canvas work apron over a faded blue dress, her dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades, and she was pulling at that rusted sluice box with the kind of determination that made Samuel feel, even from 50 yards away, slightly embarrassed about how little effort he had put into anything recently. He nudged his horse, a bay gelding named Casper, down the slope toward the creek, and the woman did not look up until he was nearly at the bank. "You are on private property," she said, not stopping her pulling. "I know it," Samuel said. "I own it." She looked up then. Her eyes were dark brown and they were not particularly welcoming. She was perhaps 25 or 26, he guessed, with a square jaw and the kind of face that had clearly spent a great deal of time outdoors in the Colorado sun. There was a smear of mud across her left cheek and another across the back of her hand, and she was breathing hard from the work but not showing any sign of stopping. "You own it," she repeated. "Bought it yesterday from the land office in Durango," he said. "Fellow named Tully had it listed at the county recorder's office for near on 3 years. Nobody touched it." "I touched it," she said. "You are Sadie Slater," he said. It was not a question. He had known the name from the county records. The original claim had been registered under her father's name, Hector Slater, who had died in the mine collapse of 1879. The claim had sat abandoned, tax liens piling up, until the county had finally moved to auction it. Nobody had bid except Samuel, and even the land agent had looked at him with something close to pity. "I am," she said, and she let go of the sluice box and stood up straight, and Samuel saw that she was not a small woman. She stood nearly 5.5 feet, with the broad shoulders of someone who had been doing physical labor most of her life. "My father built this claim," she said, and her voice was steady but there was something tight underneath it. "My brother and I worked it for 3 years after him. My brother left after the shaft came down. I stayed. The tax liens he started. I know about the tax liens," she said. "I have been trying to get the money together. I was 6 months from clearing them." Samuel looked down at the deed in his hand, then back at her. He had the uncomfortable sensation of a man who has done something technically legal and completely fair, and nonetheless feels like a villain. He had bought this land as an investment, or what he had hoped might become one. He had not thought much about whether anyone was still attached to it. "I paid fair value," he said, though even as the words left his mouth he knew they were not the right ones. "Fair value for a ruined claim," she said. "Yes, congratulations." She turned back to the sluice box and grabbed hold of it again. Samuel sat on his horse and watched her for a moment. He had ridden 3 days from Santa Fe to get here. He had spent most of his savings on the deed, the surveying fees, and the supplies in his saddlebags. He was 31 years old. He had failed at one mining operation already, a silver prospect in New Mexico that had turned out to be mostly wishful thinking, and he had come to the Slater claim because the geological survey he had found in a Durango library had suggested that the gold-bearing gravel layers in this particular valley went deeper than the original operators had ever reached. He had not anticipated Sadie Slater. "I have a geological survey," he said, "from a man named Professor Aldous Webb out of the Denver School of Mines. He did this valley in 1876, before your father filed the claim. The survey says the richest gravel is 12 to 15 feet below the current channel bottom. Your father never got that deep." She stopped pulling. She did not turn around immediately. "How deep did my father get?" she asked. "Survey puts the deepest work at about 8 feet, Samuel said. "He was working the upper gravels. Good return for a while, then it ran out. That is when most people gave up." She turned around now and she was looking at him differently. Not warmly, not yet, but differently. The way you look at something unexpected when you are not sure yet whether it is good or bad news. "Where did you get this survey?" she asked. "Denver Library," he said. "I spent 2 weeks going through geological records before I ever came out here. I do not invest money in guesswork." There was a pause. The creek ran over the rocks between them. A red-tailed hawk circled lazily overhead. "You invested money in the most ruined claim in the San Juan Basin," she said. "I invested money in what is underneath the most ruined claim in the San Juan Basin," he said. "There is a difference." Something shifted in her expression then. Not a smile exactly, but a softening of the suspicion. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the claim around them, the collapsed shaft, the burned cabin, the churned-up creek bank, and then she looked back at him. "You will need someone who knows this land," she said. "The creek channels, where the bedrock rises, where the clay layers are. My father mapped all of it in notebooks. I have them." "And you would share those notebooks with the man who bought your claim out from under you?" he asked. "I would share them with the man who might actually find what my father spent 15 years of his life looking for," she said. "If you are serious about going deep." "I am serious," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. "Then get off your horse and help me move this sluice box," she said. "It has been stuck on a root for 3 days." Samuel Bancroft dismounted. That was, he would think later, the moment everything began. He tied Casper to a willow branch and walked down to the creek bank and wrapped his hands around the far end of the sluice box, and together they pulled. And it came free with a great sucking noise and a shower of muddy water that covered them both. And Sadie Slater laughed. A sudden, genuine laugh that seemed to surprise even her, before she got it back under control. They set the sluice box on the bank and stood catching their breath, both of them dripping, and Samuel thought that this was perhaps the most unusual beginning to a business arrangement he had ever had. "Where are you staying?" she asked. "I had planned to camp on the claim," he said. She glanced at the half-burned cabin. "The west wall is sound," she said. "The east side is open to the weather, but it has not rained in a week. You can sleep in the main room if you set your bedroll away from the east wall." "That is generous," he said. "It is practical," she said. "I need you to not die of exposure before you can be useful." He was staying in what had been her family's cabin. He understood that, and he understood what it must cost her to say it so plainly, without a flicker of the grief that had to be underneath. He did not point that out. He simply nodded. "I appreciate it," he said, and meant it simply. She went back to work. He unsaddled Casper and set him to graze on the short grass above the creek, and then he went to the cabin and saw what she had already been doing. The east wall had been partially cleared of debris, the fallen roof beams stacked to one side, the usable lumber separated from the burned pieces. Someone had already patched 2 of the window frames with oilcloth. Someone had swept out the main room and set a cast iron stove back on its foundation stones. She had been here for some time, he realized. Not just a few days. Weeks, maybe months. He brought his saddlebags inside and set them against the sound west wall, and then he went back out to help her because it seemed like the only sensible thing to do. The first week was careful and businesslike between them. They worked from sunup to past sunset, driven by a shared urgency that came, Samuel suspected, from 2 people who had each lost enough already that they knew better than to waste time. Sadie showed him her father's notebooks, 6 of them, leather-covered, filled with a meticulous handwriting that recorded every gravel sample Hector Slater had ever taken, every depth measurement, every observation about the creek's behavior during spring runoff. Reading those notebooks at night by lantern light, Samuel felt something close to awe. Hector Slater had been an extremely careful man, and he had come tantalizingly close to the right answer. He had just never had the Webb Geological Survey. Together, Samuel and Sadie cross-referenced the notebooks against the survey, and a picture emerged that made Samuel's hands go still on the pages. The deepest gold-bearing gravels were there, exactly as the survey predicted, and they were accessible from a point about 40 feet upstream of where the original shaft had been sunk. "Your father was 30 feet from the right location," Samuel said one evening, his finger tracing the overlapping maps they had spread across the cabin floor. Sadie was quiet for a moment. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor with one of the notebooks open in her lap, and in the lantern light her face was serious and unreadable. "He did not have the survey," she said. "No. He spent 15 years not knowing he was 30 feet off," she said. "He mapped everything else perfectly," Samuel said. "His bedrock measurements are nearly exact. He was a skilled man." She closed the notebook carefully and set it aside. "He was," she said. "He was the most careful, patient man I have ever known." She paused. "He also never got angry when he was wrong. He just went back to the beginning and tried again." A small pause. "I got the stubbornness from him. My mother always said so." "Where is your mother?" he asked, and then immediately wished he had chosen a gentler way to ask it. Sadie looked at him steadily. "She died of fever when I was 12, she said. "It was just my father and my brother Cal and me after that. And Cal left after the shaft came down. He had a wife by then and a child on the way," she said. "I did not blame him for leaving. He asked me to come with them. They are in Denver now. Cal works in a dry goods store." Something in her tone was not critical, just factual, and underneath it Samuel heard the loneliness of a person who had stayed in a hard place alone. "Why did you stay?" he asked. She looked at him as though the answer were completely obvious. "Because my father believed there was gold here," she said. "And he was right. He spent everything he had on this claim. I was not going to walk away from that." Samuel looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. She was not a romantic type, or at least she did not present herself as one. She was practical and direct, and she had a habit of stating difficult truths without softening them. But he had noticed, in the week they had been working together, a dozen small things that told him a different story about who she was underneath. The way she had quietly moved a robin's nest from a fence post before they pulled the post out, so as not to destroy the eggs. The way she hummed to herself, without seeming to know she was doing it when she was doing work she found satisfying. The way she had, on the third day, handed him a tin cup of coffee without asking whether he wanted it, because she had simply noticed he needed it. He noticed these things. He tried not to notice them too much. They hired 2 men from the town of Anima's Crossing, about 4 miles east down the valley. A wiry ex-cowhand named Pete Dobbs who had come west from Texas 10 years ago chasing cattle drives and stayed when the cattle work thinned out. And a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Oscar Veen who had come down from the north, and who, as far as Samuel could tell, communicated primarily through nods and occasional grunts that seemed to mean different things depending on context. Both men were good workers and fair-minded, and they did not ask too many questions, which Samuel valued. Anima's Crossing itself was a small place, barely 400 people, a general store owned by a man named Tobias Hart who seemed to know everyone's business before they knew it themselves, a saloon called the Pony, a church, a livery, and a land broker's office that was currently also serving as the post office. There was a county sheriff based out of Durango, 40 miles west, and a deputy in Anima's Crossing named Walt Griggs who was competent and unhurried, and had a pleasantly unshockable quality that Samuel appreciated. The town's reaction to Samuel buying the Slater claim, and then immediately working it alongside Sadie Slater, was a complicated mixture of curiosity and speculation that expressed itself in the way of small frontier towns, through Tobias Hart asking questions while measuring out flour, and through the women at the church taking an intense interest in Sadie's social calendar, and through Pete Dobbs informing Samuel casually one afternoon that he was, quote, the talk of the valley. For what reason? Samuel asked, driving a survey stake into the ground. Well, partly because you bought the claim no one else would touch, Pete said. and partly because of Miss Sadie working alongside you like a hired hand." "She is not a hired hand," Samuel said. "She knows this land better than anyone. She is an essential partner in this operation." Pete nodded as if he had expected this answer and found it interesting. "That is not exactly how Tobias Hart is telling it," he said. "How is Tobias Hart telling it?" Pete tilted his head. "He is telling it as a woman who lost her father's claim having to work for the man who took it." Samuel straightened up and looked at Pete. "That is not what happened," he said. "No, sir," Pete agreed cheerfully. "But it is a better story for the men at the Pony." Samuel made a note to have a conversation with Tobias Hart. He also made a note, internally, that the way the town was framing this situation could make Sadie's position in it more difficult than it needed to be, and that bothered him in a way that was perhaps more personal than strictly professional. The new shaft went in 10 days after they had identified the location. It was hard, meticulous work shoring the walls as they went, managing the water table as they descended, hauling the gravel up in buckets for washing. Samuel worked in the shaft himself, alongside Oscar Veen, while Pete Dobbs and Sadie ran the sluice at the creek. They had rebuilt the sluice box over the first week, using lumber from the salvageable sections of the cabin's east wall and some new planking from the general store in Anima's Crossing, and it was a neat, efficient piece of work that Sadie had largely designed, drawing on her memory of how her father had run the original operation, and on some improvements she had evidently thought through during her months of solitary work on the claim. At 8 feet down, they began to find promising color in the gravel. At 10 feet, Samuel came up from the shaft at the end of a long afternoon with a tin pan half full of washed gravel, and when he and Sadie crouched over it at the creek bank and worked through it together, there were 7 flakes of raw gold catching the late light, each one the size of a small fingernail. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They just looked at what was in the pan, and then Sadie looked up and her eyes were bright, and Samuel felt something move in his chest that had nothing to do with gold. "There it is," she said softly. "There it is," he agreed. She reached into the pan and picked up one of the flakes between her thumb and forefinger and held it up to the light, and her expression was not triumphant. It was something deeper than that. It was a woman who had spent 3 years defending a dead man's faith, holding proof that the faith was justified. "He was right," she said. Her voice was steady, but just barely. "He was absolutely right," Samuel said. She set the flake back carefully and closed her hand around the pan. He saw her jaw work, and he understood she was not going to cry, or rather, that if she was going to cry, it would be when she was alone, not here in front of him, and he respected that about her even as he wished there were something more he could offer than just witnessing it. He did not look away, because looking away felt like the wrong thing too. He stayed right where he was. After a moment she stood up and took a steady breath. "We should get the assay results before we get excited," she said. "Absolutely," he said, but they were both smiling and the smiles were real. Over the next 3 weeks, as they went deeper and the color got richer, the operational shape of their partnership began to clarify. Samuel handled the purchasing and the equipment decisions and the financial tracking. Sadie ran the surface operation, the sluice, the gravel washing, the daily cleanup, and also served as his primary advisor on the creek's behavior and the claim's geology, because she knew both better than any paid expert he could have brought in. They divided the proceeds on a 50-50 basis, which Samuel had proposed on the 2nd week, and which had surprised Sadie into a long silence before she had said yes. "You bought the claim," she said. "50-50 is more than fair. You have the knowledge without which the claim is worth nothing," he said. "That seems like an equal contribution to me." She had looked at him with that considering look she had, the one where she seemed to be deciding whether to trust something. Then she had said, "All right then, 50-50. She could have pushed back. She could have argued that he was being overly generous, could have deflected with practicality, could have found 10 ways to minimize what her contribution was worth. The fact that she did not, that she simply evaluated his logic and accepted it as fair, told him a great deal about her character. The town's opinion had begun to shift. Deputy Griggs had come out to the claim one afternoon in late May to check in on things standard enough, as there had been some trouble between claim holders further up the valley, a dispute about water rights that had gotten heated, and he had seen the operation running smoothly and had nodded at Sadie with the respect of a man who had known her for several years. Good to see the Slater claim working again, he told her. It was always working, she told him pleasantly. Just needed to go deeper. Samuel, watching from the shaft entrance, had found this exchange privately satisfying. The trouble with Tobias Hart was eventually addressed not by a conversation, but by a different, more organic mechanism: gold. When the first assay came back from Durango, 4 ounces from a single week's work at the deeper level, and word got around Anima's crossing. As word always did, the narrative in the pony shifted from a story about a fallen woman working for the man who had dispossessed her to a story about a smart partnership that everyone in the valley had missed the chance to be part of. Tobias Hart began asking questions at the general store about their equipment needs instead of their personal arrangements, which Samuel considered an improvement. What was changing between him and Sadie, meanwhile, was not something either of them named or even fully acknowledged for a while. It was accumulating the way gold accumulates in a sluice box, grain by grain, almost invisible until suddenly you realize there is a weight there that was not there before. It was the evening at the end of May when they had a serious thunderstorm roll through the valley, and Samuel woke in the night to the sound of the creek running high, and found Sadie already outside in the rain, by lantern light, stacking sandbags around the base of the new shaft to keep the floodwater out. He pulled on his boots and went out and worked beside her for 2 hours in the pouring rain until the shaft was protected, and at the end of it they stood in the cabin doorway watching the lightning move east over the mountains, both of them drenched and breathing hard. "You could have woken me," he said. "I did not want to wake you if it turned out to be nothing," she said. "Next time wake me," he said. "We are partners." She looked at him sideways. "You have a strong feeling about that," she said. "Yes," he said simply. She turned to look at him then fully, in the way she had that felt like she was deciding something. The rain was easing. The lantern on the table behind them threw a warm light through the doorway. "All right," she said. "Next time I will wake you." It was not a declaration of anything, but he remembered it. The moment that broke something open between them happened on a Saturday in early June. They had ridden into Anima's crossing together for supplies, Sadie on her gray mare Alina and Samuel on Casper, and while Samuel was at the general store, she had gone to the post office to collect mail. When he came out with the supply boxes, he found her standing in the street with a letter in her hand and an expression on her face that was the most unguarded he had ever seen her. She was not upset exactly, but she was very still in the way that people go still when something touches a deep place. He tied the horse's reins to the rail and went to her. "Bad news," she looked up. "My brother is sending money," she said, "to help with the claim." Samuel waited. "He did not know I was already working it again," she said. "He writes that he has been saving for a year and a half. He says," she stopped. She looked back at the letter. "He says he knows he should have stayed. He says he thinks about it." "Do you want to be alone with that?" Samuel asked. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the pocket of her canvas apron. "No," she said, which surprised him. "I think I would rather have company." They stood in the street of Anima's crossing in the June morning sunlight, with dust rising from the road and horses tied at the rail of the pony across the way, and she said, "He built that claim with his own hands, same as me, same as my father. That is 3 people's worth of work and hope and sorrow in that ground. And sometimes I feel the weight of it, and sometimes it just feels like home." Samuel looked at her profile, the strong jaw, the direct eyes, the set of her shoulders that was so characteristic of her, that particular straightness that was not rigidity but resolve. "You are remarkable," he said. She looked at him, and the surprise on her face was real. He did not think many people had said that to her directly without qualification. He had not planned to say it. It had simply come out as the truest thing available. "I am stubborn," she said. "That too," he agreed. "Both things are true." She looked at him a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and something in her expression softened in a way that was different from before. Not the considering look, not the evaluating look, but something more open, something that had not been there in the first weeks. Then she said, "We should get the supplies loaded," and went to her horse, and Samuel went to Casper, and they rode back to the claim with the supply boxes balanced across the saddles and did not speak much on the way home. But the silence was a completely different kind of silence than it had been a month ago. The man who tested everything was named Harlan Kress. Harlan Kress was a land speculator out of Durango who had developed a habit of identifying profitable small mining claims in the San Juan Basin, once they were clearly viable, and then applying pressure to buy them out cheaply before the operators had enough capital to negotiate from strength. He was not a criminal, exactly. He operated through legal means. He was simply a man who had noticed that small, independent operators often ran short of cash at crucial moments, and that those moments were excellent times to make offers. He arrived at the Slater claim on a Wednesday morning in late June, riding a good black horse and dressed better than anyone for 30 miles, and he introduced himself with the smooth, practiced friendliness of a man who had done a great deal of introducing himself. "Impressive operation for 2 people," he said, looking around the claim with the practiced eyes of someone doing arithmetic. "4 people," Sadie said from the sluice, not looking up. "Right," Kress said, with a small smile that indicated Pete Dobbs and Oscar Veen did not register as significant factors in his calculation. He turned to Samuel. "I have followed the assay results from Durango with some interest, Mr. Bancroft. You have found something real here." "We know," Samuel said. "I am prepared to make a very fair offer for the operational interest," Kress said. "Very fair. Cash, no conditions, out of your hands and someone else's problem." "It is not a problem," Sadie said. She had stopped working now and was looking at Kress with the expression of someone who has recognized a type. "Miss Slater," Kress said, with the tone of a man making an effort at patience. "You have been working this claim on and off for 3 years. You know better than anyone how much has already gone into it for how little out." "I know exactly how much has gone into it," she said, "including my father's life." A brief pause. "Of course," Kress said, with respect, "but sentiment is not what is keeping us here," Samuel said, and his voice was quieter now, which was the way his voice got when he was serious. "We are staying through to production. That is the plan. We are not looking for an exit." Kress looked at him with a tolerant expression. "You are at the stage where you need to scale up significantly to reach production levels that justify the investment. That takes capital. Considerably more than you currently have, I would estimate." "We appreciate your visit," Samuel said. Kress stayed another 20 minutes, talking around the same subject from different angles. He was good at it. He made each approach seem like a different conversation, found different ways to frame the same offer. Samuel answered him consistently, and Sadie at one point went back to work at the sluice, which communicated more clearly than any words that she was done with the conversation. Eventually Kress rode out. Samuel watched him go from the shaft entrance. "He will come back," Sadie said. "I expect so," Samuel said. "My father had a man like that come around twice," she said. "Each time just when things were looking most difficult." Samuel turned to look at her. "What did your father do?" "The first time he ran him off with a shotgun," she said. "The second time he just pointed at the shotgun and the man left without a word being spoken." Samuel nodded. "I do not have a shotgun." "I have my father's," she said. He looked at her. She was serious. He felt a smile pull at the corner of his mouth. "Let us try conversation first," he said. "Already tried it," she said. He did not seem to hear it. "He heard it," Samuel said. "He is just hoping we will change our minds." "We will not change our minds, and eventually he will find someone easier." She looked at him steadily. "You are sure?" "I am sure," he said. "But thank you for the offer of the shotgun." The smallest flicker of amusement crossed her face. "It is there if you need it," she said. What came with the following weeks was both the hardest and the best stretch of work Samuel had ever done in his life. They were pulling reasonable gold from the deeper gravel, enough to cover operational costs and Pete and Oscar's wages and a modest surplus. But Cress had not been entirely wrong that scaling up required capital. Samuel made 2 trips to Durango to meet with a banking house about a small operating loan, and both trips were long, exhausting days of convincing conservative men in good clothes that a mining claim everyone had written off was in fact a sound investment. On the second trip, Sadie came with him. This had been her suggestion, and it was a good one. She brought her father's notebooks and the updated assay results and the geological survey, and she laid them all out on the banker's desk with the methodical confidence of someone who knew the material cold. And she answered questions about the geology and the operational approach with a precision that clearly impressed the banker, a heavy-set man named James Caldwell, even as he was evidently uncertain what to make of her presence in his office. "It is unusual," Caldwell said carefully, meaning the whole situation. "Unusual operations find what usual ones miss," Sadie said pleasantly. "They got the loan." It was smaller than Samuel had wanted, but enough to do what needed doing. On the ride back to Anima's Crossing, 50 miles of rough road in the back of a hired wagon with the evening turning purple over the mountains ahead of them, Sadie said, "You have done that before, gone into rooms like that and argued for something you believe in." "Once before," Samuel said. "It did not work out." "The silver prospect in New Mexico," she said. He looked at her. He had told her about it briefly in one of their evenings going over the maps. He had not realized she had stored the detail. "Yes," he said. "I was wrong about that one. The geology was not sound." "But you were right to believe it could work," she said. "I was right about the idea," he said. "Wrong about the specific location." She nodded slowly. "That is the hardest kind of failure," she said, "when the reasoning is good but the facts do not cooperate." "How do you know that?" She looked out at the mountains. "Because my father was right about the idea for 15 years before the facts cooperated," she said. "I watched it wear on him, the rightness of it not being enough." He thought about that for a long time as they rode. The mountains deepened to black against a sky going orange and green. The horses plodded steadily. "What kept him going?" Samuel asked. She considered the question with the care she gave everything. "Pride partly," she said, "stubbornness, but mostly," she paused. "Mostly he said that giving up on something you knew was true felt like a kind of lie, like admitting a falsehood to make your life easier." Samuel looked at her profile in the evening light. She was not talking about herself. Or she was, but not only about herself. He understood that she was also, in some sideways fashion, telling him something about the kind of person she was, that she stayed with true things even when they were hard, and that she had no patience for comfortable lies. He said, "I am glad I bought the claim." She turned to look at him, and in the light her eyes were very warm, and she said, "I am glad you did too." The silence after that was a different kind entirely. Not the careful silence of 2 people maintaining professional distance, not the comfortable silence of colleagues at ease with each other. This was the kind of silence that has a weight to it, the kind that means something is present between 2 people that has not been spoken yet. He did not speak it that night. They arrived back in Anima's Crossing after dark, returned the wagon, rode the last 4 miles to the claim in companionable quiet under a brilliant Colorado sky, and went to their separate sleeping arrangements in the cabin, he on his side of the main room, she in the smaller back room she had reclaimed once they had repaired the east wall. But something had settled into the air of the place that had not been there before, something that was either going to be addressed or was going to make everything between them more complicated. It was Pete Dobbs, of all people, who addressed it first, and not in the way Samuel expected. He came to Samuel one morning about a week after the Durango trip, while Oscar and Sadie were running the sluice, and said with the directness of a Texas cowhand who had never seen the point in going around things, "I want to say something, and I hope you will not fire me for it." "I have not fired anyone for talking yet," Samuel said. "Fair enough," Pete said. I have worked for a number of people in my years, and I have seen a number of arrangements, and I want you to know that what is happening here. The way Miss Sadie is being treated, as a full partner, as someone whose knowledge counts, that is not common. And she knows that. And it matters to her, even if she does not say it the way most women would. Samuel looked at him. I'm not telling you how to live your life, Pete said quickly. I'm just saying that she is a fine woman and she does not let many people close, and from what I can see you are one of the few who has gotten anywhere near, and that is worth something if you are a man who is paying attention. I am a man who is paying attention, Samuel said. Pete nodded. Good, he said. That is all I had. He went back to the shaft. Samuel stood for a moment, then went to the sluice. He waited until Oscar had gone to the far side of the creek for a new bucket, and then he said, without looking at Sadie directly, focusing on the water running through the sluice, I have been thinking about what you said on the road back from Durango. Which part? She said. About your father staying with things he knew were true, he said. A pause. The water ran. Oscar was visible on the far bank, his back to them. Yes, she said. He turned then and looked at her directly. I think I have been behaving in a way that is not entirely honest, he said. Not in any material matter. The partnership is exactly what I said it is, but in another matter. She met his eyes. She was very still. I am telling you this because you are a person who values honesty more than comfort, he said, and because I would rather be honest with you than comfortable. Go on, she said. I have felt, for some time now, considerably more than professional regard for you, he said. And I have not said anything because you have enough complications in your life without me adding to them, and because we are partners and I did not want to change something that was working. But I find that not saying it has become its own kind of problem. She held his gaze for a long, still moment. The water ran between the sluice boards. Somewhere up the valley, a crow called. How long? She asked. Since approximately the night of the thunderstorm, he said. When I came out and found you already sandbagging in the rain, she let out a slow breath. And then very quietly she said, I have been pretending for some time that I did not know what I felt, because I thought it would complicate things, and because I am not easy in that way. It does not come naturally to me trusting that sort of thing. I know, he said. You do not mind that. No, he said simply. I think the things that are worth having generally require some difficulty. She looked at him, and in her expression was everything she was not quite saying yet, the caution of someone who had been alone a long time and was not certain she remembered how to be otherwise, and under that, something warmer and more direct that was fighting its way to the surface. I am not going to say anything pretty, she said. I do not have pretty things to say. She stopped. She looked at the water for a moment, then back at him. I just think you are the best person I have met in a very long time, Samuel, and I think I would very much like you to stay. It was not the most romantic declaration he had ever heard. It was also, without question, the most meaningful thing anyone had ever said to him. I am not going anywhere, he said. She nodded once as if this settled something fundamental, and then she said, Oscar is coming back. Help me with this gravel. He took up the pan and helped her with the gravel, and they worked side by side in the June sunlight. And Oscar came back across the creek and noticed nothing unusual, or if he did notice something unusual he was, blessedly, the sort of man who kept it to himself. What changed between them after that was slow and real, and very much in keeping with who they both were, not sudden, not dramatic, but accumulating with the same steady patience as everything else they did together. He started leaving the better cup of coffee for her in the mornings, and she started saving the best of the fire's warmth for his corner of the cabin on cold nights. They began sitting closer to each other in the evenings when they went over the maps, not from necessity but from preference, and neither of them commented on it. The first time he touched her hand on purpose, not the accidental grazes that had been happening for weeks, but deliberately, reaching across the table one evening to cover her hand with his when she was explaining something from her father's notebook and her voice had caught unexpectedly on a passage in Hector's handwriting. She went still, and then she turned her hand over under his and held on. They stayed like that for a moment. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the creek ran on as it always did. "He would have liked you," she said. "My father. He had no patience for fools and a great deal of patience for people who took things seriously." "I hope to be worth that assessment," Samuel said. She squeezed his hand once, then let go and turned back to the notebook. But she was smiling. He could see it in her profile. Harlan Kress came back at the beginning of July, as Sadie had predicted. He came at a slightly worse time than his first visit. They had hit a 2-week stretch where the gravel was yielding less than expected, a geologic quirk that Samuel was fairly sure was temporary, but that had dented the operating account more than he liked. Kress had either heard about it or he had simply timed his return for maximum psychological effect. This time he brought a written offer, a formally prepared document from a Durango law office, setting out a cash purchase price for the operational interest. The number was not outright insulting, but it was considerably below what Samuel estimated the claim's actual value to be at full production. Samuel read the document, set it on the table, and said, "No. You are at a difficult point operationally," Kress said. "I can see that in the production numbers. Take the offer now and walk away clean." "We are not walking away," Samuel said. "Miss Slater," Kress said, turning to where Sadie was standing near the door, "you have put years of your life into this ground. You could take this money and start fresh somewhere. A woman in your position should not have to take offers from people who are counting on her to be desperate," Sadie said. Her voice was completely level. "My position, Mr. Kress, is that of a co-owner of a producing claim that is temporarily running below peak yield. That is not the same position as desperate, and I would ask you not to confuse the two." Kress looked at her and Samuel saw something shift in his expression, a recalculation, a reassessment. He looked back at Samuel. "The offer stands for 30 days, he said. "The answer will be the same in 30 days, Samuel said. "But you are welcome to come back if you would like to hear it again in person." Kress left. Samuel watched him ride out and then turned to find Sadie watching him. She had her arms crossed over her chest and she was looking at the door where Kress had gone out. "He is going to try something else," she said. "Men like that do not stop at 2 polite visits. What do you think he will do?" "The water rights question," she said. "There is an old filing on the creek water, a grist mill claim from 1869 that was never fully resolved. It predates my father's operation. If someone bought that filing and made a challenge to our water usage, it would tie us up in county courts for 6 months to a year. You know about this filing." "My father knew about it," she said. "He never thought anyone would bother with it because the original claimant died without heirs, but it is still in the county records as an unresolved matter." Samuel sat down at the table. This was the kind of problem that required thinking. He looked up at Sadie, who had not sat down but was moving slowly, the way she always did when she was working through something. "How do we get ahead of it?" he asked. "We go to Durango before he does," she said. "We petition the county court to close the unresolved mill claim on the grounds of abandonment. If we file first and the court agrees, there is no hanging filing for him to purchase." "Can we do that?" "A friend of my father's, a man named George Hale, is a solicitor in Durango. He is honest and he charges fair rates. I will write to him today." Samuel looked at her with the admiration that had become so much a part of how he saw her that he barely noticed it anymore, except when it came up sharp and clear like this. Her thoroughness, the way she was always 3 moves ahead, the way she carried the knowledge of this land and its history not as a burden but as a tool. "Write the letter," he said. "I will write it to Anima's Crossing this afternoon." She wrote the letter. He wrote it to the post office. George Hale, solicitor of Durango, replied within a week and confirmed that the petition could be filed and that he could do it for a fee that was within their budget. Kress, when he next came to the land recorder's office in Durango, which they heard about from Deputy Griggs, who had a reliable network of informants across the county, found that the unresolved mill claim had been closed by court order 3 days prior. He did not come back to the claim after that. Pete Dobbs heard about it in the Pony and came back to the claim grinning. Word is Cress is telling people in Durango that the Slater claim is more trouble than it is worth, he said. Good, Sadie said. That is the correct assessment. Oscar, who was mending a section of sluice board nearby, gave a single definitive nod that communicated his satisfaction with this outcome in its entirety. July became August, and the deeper gravel opened up into what Samuel, cross-referencing with the web survey, realized was the primary gold-bearing layer the professor had identified. The yields tripled in a single week. The first week of August alone brought in enough gold to pay off the operating loan from James Caldwell's bank in Durango and leave a significant surplus. On the evening of the day they got the assay back from Durango confirming the August figures, Samuel and Sadie sat on the steps of the repaired cabin. The east wall fully rebuilt now, new roof, new window frames, the whole structure solid and even pleasant-looking, and watched the sun go down over the valley, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Sadie said, "My father would have been sitting exactly here. On these steps. He rebuilt these steps twice," she said. "He was very particular about them. He said that a good set of steps meant you were staying." Samuel looked at the steps they were sitting on. They were solid, well-cut, good lumber. He had helped her build them, actually, 2 weeks ago, on a Sunday afternoon when Pete and Oscar were in town. They had argued pleasantly about the angle of the risers and then agreed on something between their two positions, and the finished steps were better than either had proposed individually. "I am staying," he said. He meant it as a statement of fact about the claim, but when he said it, he also meant something else, and they both knew it. She leaned against his shoulder. It was the first time she had done that, a small, quiet movement, her shoulder against his arm, her head tilting slightly toward him. He did not move. He just let it happen, let the warmth of it settle around them. "Wrote to Cal," she said. "I told him about the August numbers. I told him," a pause. "I told him he does not need to send money. I told him things had changed." "Did you tell him how they changed?" A small pause. "I told him I had a good partner." "Just a partner," he said, and kept his voice mild. She lifted her head and looked at him sideways with that particular look, the evaluating one, but warmer now than it had ever been, with the warmth that was becoming so familiar to him. "I did not know what word to use," she said honestly. "We have not," she stopped. "I have not used a word yet." "Would you like to use one?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment in the evening light. The mountains to the west were going red and gold, and the creek ran its constant accompaniment, and somewhere in the claim's middle distance Pete Dobbs was whistling something vaguely recognizable as a Texas cattle song. "I think I would," she said, "when I know what the right one is." "Take your time," he said. "I am not good at taking time in the conventional sense," she said. "I tend to either move very slowly or," she stopped. "Or," he said. She looked at him, and the look was entirely open now, none of the careful reserves that had characterized the first months. Just Sadie Slater looking at him straight, the way she looked at geological surveys and county court filings and creek water levels, directly, completely, without evasion. "Or decide," she said. He turned toward her on the steps. The evening light was warm and red on her face. She did not look away. "Have you decided?" he asked. "I believe I have," she said. He kissed her then, gently, one hand against her jaw, and she kissed him back with the same quiet certainty that she brought to everything, not tentative, not surprised, but present and deliberate and warm. When they separated, she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, something that was very soft and very private, the expression of someone allowing themselves to want something. "All right then," she said quietly. "All right then," he agreed. From inside the cabin, Pete Dobbs had apparently come in at some point during the previous 5 minutes and was now very loudly rearranging the coffee tin, a piece of pantomime so transparent that Samuel almost laughed. "He saw," Sadie said, a hint of dry amusement in her voice. "He sees everything," Samuel said. "He will tell Oscar." "Oscar will nod once," Samuel said, and never mention it again." "That is the ideal response," she said. He took her hand and she let him hold it, and they sat on the steps her father had built and rebuilt, watching the last of the August light leave the valley. The letter from Cal Slater arrived in the third week of August, and Sadie read it twice at the kitchen table before setting it down with a particular expression on her face. Samuel, eating breakfast across from her, waited. "He is coming," she said. "To visit. To see the operation," she said. "He wants to know if there is work for him." She paused. "He wants to come home." There was a great deal in those 3 words. Samuel set down his fork. "How do you feel about that?" She considered it in the careful way she considered things. "I feel a pause. I feel that this was always supposed to be a family claim, and there is enough here now for a family to work." Another pause. "And I feel that 3 years is a long time to be angry with someone for making a reasonable choice, and I have been angry with Cal for 3 years, and I think I would like to stop." "That is very clear thinking," he said. "It took me 3 years to get there," she said. "I am a slow processor of some things." "Write to him," Samuel said. "Tell him to come." She looked at him, making sure this was not something he was saying because it was what she wanted to hear, making sure he actually meant it. He held her gaze steadily. "You are sure," she said. "It is your claim, too." "It has always been a Slater claim," he said. "The name on the deed is mine. The heart of the place has always been yours. Cal belongs here if he wants to be here." She looked at him with that open warmth that he had come to understand was her version of what other people expressed with considerably more effusion. And then she said, "I will write to him today." Cal Slater arrived at the end of September. A lean, dark-haired man of about 30, who had his sister's directness and his father's quiet gravity, and who showed up at the claim looking slightly uncertain until he saw the operation running at full capacity. And then his face changed entirely, becoming the face of a man seeing something he had doubted was possible. He and Sadie embraced in the middle of the claim with the restraint of 2 people who had been raised not to make large displays of feeling, which meant it was slightly awkward and entirely genuine, and when they separated Cal held his sister at arm's length and looked at her. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said, and turned to draw Samuel into the conversation. Cal shook Samuel's hand with a grip that communicated assessment and the beginnings of trust. They spent the afternoon going over the operation, Samuel explaining the geological rationale, and Cal asking sharp, intelligent questions that made clear he had inherited more of his father's mining knowledge than his departure had suggested. That evening, with Pete and Oscar and Cal all gathered at the table and Sadie cooking at the stove, she had become, without any particular announcement, the person who handled the cabin's meals, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she was good at it and seemed to find it satisfying after a day of physical work. The cabin felt, for the first time, full in the way that places feel when enough people are in them. After dinner, when Pete and Oscar had gone back to the tent they shared on the east side of the claim, and Cal had gone to wash up at the creek, Samuel came up beside Sadie at the stove where she was banking the fire. "He is a good man," he said. "He is," she agreed. "He is also looking at everything in a particular way." "What way?" "The way you look at something that might be home again," she said, "if you let it. Is that all right with you?" She stirred the coals. "It is more than all right," she said. "It is what I hoped for." "Good," he said. She set the poker against the stove wall and turned to face him, and she said without any particular preamble, which was entirely in character, "Samuel, I want to ask you something." "Ask it," he said. "Where did you plan to be in 5 years?" she said. "When you first bought this claim, before any of this, where did you think you would be?" He thought about it honestly. "I thought I would either make enough to buy a proper piece of land and settle somewhere, or I would have failed again and need to find a different way," he said. "I did not have a very specific picture." "And now," she said. He looked at her. The fire behind her was low and warm, throwing soft light up her face, and outside the window the mountain dark was complete and the stars were thick. "Now I have a very specific picture," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Of what?" she said. Not testing, not coy, just asking because she was a person who wanted to know the precise shape of things. Of here, he said, this valley, this claim, you, a beat of quiet. Me specifically, she said. You very specifically, he said. She was quiet for a moment looking at him. Then she said, I have been thinking about something for about a month. Tell me, he said. The cabin needs a proper addition if more than 2 people are going to live in it, she said. The east side has room for another 2 rooms if we set the foundation right before winter. He looked at her. She met his eyes with complete composure, but there was a color in her face that had not been there a moment ago. Are you asking me to build an addition to this cabin? He said carefully. I am suggesting that if a person were going to stay in this valley long term, she said, and if that person were to enter into a formal arrangement with another person who was also staying in this valley long term, it would be practical to plan the building before the first snow. Sadie, he said. Yes, she said. Are you proposing to me through a carpentry discussion? She held his gaze for another moment, then said, very quietly, I am proposing to you. The carpentry discussion is separate but related. He stepped forward and took both her hands, and she led him, looking up at him with that directness that was so fundamental to who she was. Yes, he said, on both counts. The smile that came over her face then was unlike anything he had seen before, full and unguarded and luminous. The smile of someone who has been very careful for a very long time and has decided, finally, to stop being careful. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the fire popped in the stove. And outside the creek ran on as it always did, and it was, Samuel would think later, the best evening of his life to date. They were married in November, in the small church in Anima's Crossing, on a day when the mountains were already white with early snow, and the valley was gold and brown, and the air had the particular cold clarity of Colorado in late autumn. The minister was a man named Reverend Claiborne, who had been performing marriages in the San Juan Basin for 15 years, and who conducted the service with a warmth that came from having married a great many people who genuinely meant what they were saying. Cal Slater stood for his sister. Pete Dobbs stood for Samuel, because Pete had simply declared, 3 days before the wedding, that he would be doing so, and no one had seen any reason to argue. Oscar Veen was present, and was seen by several witnesses to nod once during the exchange of vows, in what those witnesses agreed was a nod of unmistakable emotional approval. Tobias Hart from the general store was there, and Deputy Griggs, and James Caldwell the banker had ridden out from Durango, which surprised both of them. A number of townspeople came, because Anima's Crossing was a small town and weddings were important events, and because the story of the Slater claim had become something the valley felt a particular investment in. Sadie wore a dress that she and a woman named Mrs. Clara Drummond, the minister's wife, had spent 3 weeks making a deep blue that matched the October sky, with a simple fitted bodice and a full skirt. She did not wear anything elaborate. She looked, in Samuel's opinion, more beautiful than anyone he had ever seen in his life, and he was aware that this opinion was entirely biased and also entirely correct. When she came down the church aisle on Cal's arm, she was looking straight at Samuel with those direct brown eyes, and what was in them was everything. The whole long road from the morning he had ridden into the valley to find her already knee-deep in the creek, through the careful months of building trust and work and something neither of them had called love, until they were both sure enough to say it straight out. He said his vows clearly and meant every word. She said hers with the precise deliberateness that was entirely her, looking him in the eyes without flinching, and when Reverend Claiborne pronounced them married, she did not wait to be prompted to kiss him. She simply leaned in and did it herself, which made several people in the pews laugh softly, and which made Samuel, in the moment, feel something so expansive and warm that he was briefly unsure if a person could contain it. Afterward there was a gathering in the town hall, food and cider, and a fiddle player named Jed Marsh who could play for hours without repeating himself, and Pete Dobbs danced with every woman present at least once, and Oscar stood near the wall with a cup of cider and was content. And Cal Slater got slightly tearful over his sister in a way that he would firmly deny if asked about later. And Samuel and Sadie danced together 3 times and then stood near the wall with their hands interlocked and watched the room and were quietly and completely happy. "What are you thinking?" he asked her at one point. "I am thinking," she said, looking around the room, "that my father would have eaten 3 servings of Clara Drummond's apple cake and talked to every person here about the geological composition of the valley. In that order, in that exact order," she said. "He was very social after eating." He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly against his lips. She looked at him with the quiet warmth that was becoming as familiar and necessary as the sound of the creek. "I am also thinking," she said, "that I am very glad you came." "I am very glad I came," he said. The winter that followed was the first Samuel had spent in one place with real intention behind it. They built the cabin addition before the snows came down in earnest, 2 rooms on the east side, well insulated, with a connecting door to the main room, and Cal moved into one of them, and the main room became properly communal space. A table big enough for 4 people and shelves for books and Hector Slater's notebooks and Samuel's geological surveys and the various accumulated papers of a working mining operation. The claim ran a reduced winter operation. Cold weather sluicing was possible but less efficient, and they focused the winter months on deepening the shaft to ensure spring production would be maximum. Oscar Veen, who turned out to be from Minnesota originally, and therefore entirely undaunted by Colorado winters, worked the shaft with the same equanimity he brought to everything. Pete Dobbs complained about the cold in an entertaining and sustained fashion, while nonetheless doing his full share of the work. In the evenings, the 4 of them, Samuel, Sadie, Cal, and often Pete, since Oscar seemed to prefer his own company after working hours, sat around the stove and talked about everything. The claim's geology, the valley's history, the political situation in Denver where a great deal of debate was happening about the future of Colorado territory, and the rights of small claim holders versus the large mining corporations that were beginning to move into the region. Sadie had strong opinions about this, as she had strong opinions about most things, and her analysis was invariably clear-eyed and worth listening to. "The corporations will come," she said one evening with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing weather. "They have the capital to go deep in ways that individual operators cannot sustain. The question is whether the law will protect independent claims or whether it will find ways to accommodate consolidation." "What do you think it will do?" Cal asked. "I think it will do both," she said, "in different places and different times. Which means the only protection is being profitable enough that you are not attractive as an acquisition." She looked at Samuel, "which is why going deeper still matters." "We are already at 20 feet, he said. "Professor Webb's survey suggests the primary channel continues to 35, she said. "That is a significant shaft," he said. "Yes," she said simply. He looked at her, she looked back. He said, "All right, we plan for 35 in the spring." Cal was looking between the 2 of them with an expression that was part amusement and part something warmer. "You 2 are the same person," he said. "We are extremely different," Sadie said. "You make each other's arguments before the other one has to make them," Cal said. "That is the same as being the same person." "That is called a functional partnership," Sadie said. "It is called being in love," Cal said cheerfully, and Sadie threw a piece of bread crust at him, which he caught and ate, and the evening went on in its comfortable way. Samuel watched Sadie that winter with the attention of a man who is still, even now, regularly surprised by what he sees. She was reading more. She had always been a reader, he knew, but with the operational pressure eased by winter and the evenings long, she went through books at a pace that impressed him. History, mostly, and geology, but also novels, which she claimed were for relaxation, and which she then proceeded to analyze at length over breakfast. She had started keeping her own notebook, separate from her father's records observations about the valley's ecology, bird sightings, creek behavior, small details that had no immediate operational application but that she found worth recording. "What is the notebook for?" he asked one evening, watching her write in it by lamplight. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "My father kept notebooks for 30 years. Most of them turned out to be useful eventually. I am trying to form the habit." He got up from his chair and came and sat beside her, and she tilted the notebook so he could see. And he read the day's entry, a precise observation about the way the snow lay differently on the north-facing and south-facing slopes above the claim, and what that suggested about the underlying geology, and he thought, not for the first time, that he was the luckiest man in the Colorado Territory. He said so. She looked at him. "That is an exaggerated assessment," she said. "It is my honest assessment," he said. She looked at him a moment longer, then set the notebook aside and leaned in and kissed him softly, and he put his arm around her and she rested against him, and the fire was warm and the snow was falling outside and the valley was quiet. "I believe you," she said. "When you say things, I believe them." "Good," he said, "because I mean them." Spring came to the San Juan Basin in late March of 1883. First as a series of warm afternoons, and then as a sustained thaw that turned the creek loud and bright and brought the valley back into color with a speed that was almost theatrical. The claim reopened at full operation in early April, and the production in the first 2 weeks exceeded even Sadie's most optimistic projections for what the deeper gravel level would yield. By May, they had cleared the operating loan entirely, had a surplus in the Durango bank account, and were planning the next phase of shaft work with the kind of confident practicality that comes from having built something together over time and knowing exactly what you are capable of. Sadie told Samuel about the baby on a Tuesday morning in late May before breakfast, while he was still pulling on his boots. She said it the same way she said everything, directly, looking at him, without ornament. "I think we are going to need that extra room after all," she said. He looked up from his boot. She met his eyes. He stood up. "Are you sure?" he said. "Clara Drummond confirmed it last week," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I told you. A beat." "I did not know how you would." He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands and kissed her forehead, and she laughed, that sudden, genuine laugh she had, and he said against her hair, "I am more than sure of how I feel about this." She put her arms around him and he felt the steadiness of her, the solid realness of her in the morning light, and he thought, "This is the life I built. This is what staying looks like." Cal, at breakfast, reacted with the open joy that Sadie characteristically did not express. He actually whooped, startling Oscar into looking up from his coffee with an expression of mild alarm. And Pete Dobbs immediately declared that the baby would need a proper education in both geology and cattle work, and that he was available as an instructor in the latter. "The child is not born yet," Sadie said. "Best time to plan," Pete said cheerfully. Samuel, watching Sadie at the table accepting the congratulations of the people around her, with a composed pleasure that he had come to understand as her particular version of joy, felt something settle in him that was very deep and very permanent. The extra room was framed before the summer heat arrived, and finished by August, a proper nursery off the bedroom, with a window that faced the creek so the sound of the water would be the baby's constant companion. Sadie did much of the interior finish work herself, which surprised no one who knew her, and she spent one Sunday afternoon painting the window frame a clean white, and Samuel came in and found her standing back to look at it with an expression that was entirely private and entirely happy. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment without announcing himself. She turned as if she had sensed him there. "It is good," she said. "It is very good," he said. She turned back to the window. "I used to stand in this part of the claim, the east side, when I was a girl," she said. "When my father was sinking the first shaft, I used to imagine what would be built here eventually." A pause. "I imagined something like this. A nursery, a full house," she said, "full of people, full of work and noise and company." She was quiet for a moment. It was very quiet here after my father died and Cal left. It will not be quiet much longer, he said. She looked at him over her shoulder, and the expression on her face was everything. The whole complicated history of what she had held onto and what she had lost and what she had found, and underneath it, the very simple and very clear fact that she was happy. "No," she said, "it will not." Their son was born in late November of 1883, delivered by Clara Drummond and the local physician, a doctor named Hennessy who had come out from the East 2 years before, and who had a steady competence that Samuel had been grateful for during the 8 hours of labor that he spent alternating between the cabin and the cabin's front steps, which was as close as he was allowed to be. Pete Dobbs sat with him for most of it, telling stories from his cattle-driving days that Samuel heard approximately none of, and Oscar Veen was present and absolutely still in the way of a man who understood that his presence was the important part. When Dr. Hennessy came out and said that both mother and child were doing well, and that it was a healthy boy, Samuel went in and found Sadie propped up against the pillows in the lamplight looking tired and radiant and entirely herself. And in her arms was a small, firmly resolved-looking person with a quantity of dark hair who was regarding the world with the expression of someone who has just arrived and is already forming opinions. Samuel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son and did not say anything for a long moment because there was nothing adequate enough to say. "He looks like you," Sadie said. "He looks like his mother," Samuel said. "He has your forehead," she said. "He has your expression," he said. "That expression of deciding something." She looked down at the baby and something in her face was so soft and so complete that Samuel felt it in his chest. "Hector," she said, "for my father." "Hector," Samuel agreed immediately, because there had never been any other possibility. Cal, when he came in, stood at the foot of the bed looking at his nephew with the expression of a man whose opinion of the world has just substantially improved. "He looks serious," he said. "All the best people start out serious," Pete said from the doorway. Oscar Veen, permitted briefly to look in, studied the baby for a moment and then nodded once, with a gravity that encompassed the entire significance of the occasion, and returned to his coffee. The seasons that followed built upon each other with the solidity of good construction. By the spring of 1884, the claim was producing at levels that had silenced every skeptic in the San Juan Basin. The shaft reached its planned depth, and the geologic profile was exactly as the Webb survey had predicted. The deepest gravel was rich, consistently productive, and showed no signs of thinning. They hired 2 additional workers and began a careful expansion of the surface operation. Samuel wrote to Professor Webb at the Denver School of Mines, telling him that his 1876 survey had proven accurate to a degree that had changed the course of multiple lives. And the professor wrote back a warm and genuinely pleased letter that Sadie read twice, and then placed carefully in a drawer with her father's notebooks. Cal had, by the middle of 1884, become the operational lead on the surface production, which freed Samuel to manage the financial and legal dimensions of the growing enterprise and freed Sadie to do what she was, it turned out, best suited for the analytical work of understanding the claim's geology at a deep enough level to plan intelligently for its long-term development. She had begun corresponding with Professor Webb directly, sending him her own observations and her father's notebooks for his review, and Webb had written to Samuel privately to say that Sadie Slater Bancroft had one of the sharpest geological minds he had encountered, and that he hoped she might consider submitting papers to the Colorado School of Mines Journal. Samuel had shown her the letter. Her response had been to be completely silent for approximately 90 seconds, which was her version of being overwhelmed, and then to say, "He is being generous." "He is being accurate," Samuel said. She had written to Webb the following day. Hector Bancroft, whom everyone called Heck except his mother when he was in trouble, was a serious and curious and joyful child who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and the particular stubbornness that appeared to be a Slater family trait passed down with the same reliability as dark hair. He was also, from a very young age, profoundly interested in the creek. He could identify the different stones in the creek bed by name by the time he was 3, taught by his mother with the same methodical care she brought to everything. The Claims Valley, as Heck grew, was full of things for a child to discover. The creek's changing character through the seasons, the way the mountains looked different under every kind of light, the mine operation with its organized industry that his father patiently explained, and his Uncle Cal illustrated with great enthusiasm, the horses Casper and Alina grazing above the water, and Pete Dobbs, who had become a fixture of the place as permanent and reliable as the mountains themselves, and who did indeed teach the boy the basics of horsemanship before he was 4. The second baby came in the spring of 1885, another son, whom they named James after Samuel's father, and who from the first days showed a temperament that was sunnier and more immediately social than his brother's quick to laugh, easy with strangers, with his father's light eyes in a face that otherwise looked entirely like Sadie's. Heck regarded his new brother with the measured assessment of a 2-year-old forming a judgment, and eventually concluded, after approximately a week, that the arrangement was acceptable. In the evenings of that spring and summer, with both boys asleep in the nursery, they had added another room so each boy had his own space. Samuel and Sadie sat on the steps her father had built and talked about everything and nothing, the way people talk when they have built a life together that is solid enough to bear the weight of real conversation. He said one evening, watching the last light on the mountains, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "When I rode into this valley that first morning," he said, "and I saw you in the creek pulling on that sluice box, I thought this is going to be complicated." She smiled. "It was complicated." "Yes," he said. "And then I thought, but this is also remarkable." She looked at him sideways. "And then," he said, "I thought I need to get off this horse and help." She laughed, the real, full laugh that had surprised her that first morning and surprised her still sometimes with its own size. "That is the most practical romantic story I have ever heard," she said. "It is the truest one I know," he said. She leaned against him, as she had that first August evening, and he put his arm around her, and they sat with the sound of the creek and the last light on the mountains, and the muffled sound from inside the cabin of Pete Dobbs telling Heck some probably exaggerated story about cattle work in Texas. "Hector would have liked this evening," she said, her father's name. "Tell me what he would have done," Samuel said. She smiled, soft and real. "He would have counted the gold flakes from today's cleanup," she said. "And then he would have made coffee and sat here exactly like this, and he would have said," she paused, and her voice went gentle with memory, "he would have said that the best view in the world is the one you've earned." Samuel looked out at the valley, the creek catching the last light, the mountains turning purple, the Claims spread out below them with all its evidence of work and hope and time. He thought of all the miles that had led here, all the failures and the wrong turns, the silver prospect that had come to nothing, the 3 days riding to Durango, the deed warm in his breast pocket on a morning he had not yet known would change everything. He looked at Sadie beside him, her face in profile quietly content. "He was right," Samuel said. "He usually was," she said. From inside, Heck's voice rose with a question and Pete's voice answered with the expansive warmth of a man who had found his place and was happy in it. And the cabin held all of them, the living and the remembered and the yet to come. And the creek ran on through the valley that had been Hector Slater's faith, and his daughter's stubbornness and Samuel Bancroft's improbable good judgment, all 3 of them bound together in the gold-bearing gravel of a Colorado evening. The stars came out one by one above the mountains, the horses moved in the grass, the creek ran. The claim that nobody else would touch had become, against every reasonable expectation, and because of 2 unreasonably stubborn people, exactly what it had always promised to be. And the woman who had already been rebuilding it when he arrived had rebuilt, in the end, far more than a mine. She had rebuilt a home, a family, and a future in the valley where her father had always believed something worth finding lay just a little deeper down. Samuel held her hand in the mountain dark and thought, I bought this ground because I believed in what was underneath it. I had no idea what I was really buying. And Sadie, as if she heard the thought, or perhaps because she had thought it too in her own particular way, turned and looked at him with the full warmth of everything she was and said simply, "Thank you for staying." "Always," he said. And the stars wheeled slowly over the San Juan mountains, and the creek ran on, and the steps held them both.